So just to begin, I want to let people know about the chat function. It's the boring side, it's the technical side, but it's important so that everyone can participate. If you're on a computer and you're using Zoom for the first time, the chat function is accessed by clicking on chat. There's a speech bubble at the bottom of your screen and you can click on that and see what's in the chat. And the reason I'm telling you is because I've posted the links for the donation link, but also that's where we'd like you to place your questions. So if you have a question as we're going through the presentation, feel free to put it in the chat function and I'll cover those as many as we can at the end of the presentation. I'd also like to remind you, and I should say, if you're on a mobile device, your chat function you might have to access by tapping the screen or swiping. So just have a little experiment to make sure you can access the chat function if you'd like to ask questions. I recommend that you may well be on gallery view on Zoom. That is where you have lots of square boxes with lots of people in that you can view, but I do recommend that you go to speaker view for the session, partly because we'll have a slideshow presentation. It will make sure that you get the full view of that when you when we go to the presentation section, and you can in fact move the speaker if they're in the wrong place over the slides if you need to. Okay, so this week, we welcome Amal Morcos to tell us about the monastic revival in Lebanon, with particular reference to Kaftoun and Hamatoura monasteries. Originally from Cairo in Egypt, Amal attends Holy Trinity Orthodox Church in Randolph, New Jersey, in America, and is the senior content manager at St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary in New York. She loves writing about religion, and especially the priesthood, but she says that the greatest creative experience of her life was to write her master's thesis on the revival of monasticism in the Church of Antioch. I welcome Amal. I'm very grateful to her for joining us today, and I'm going to hand over to her. And let me just, I think you need to unmute yourself actually, Amal. I thought I could do it for you, but you'll just need to do that yourself. Lovely. Okay. That's it. Okay. I'll hand over to you. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Margaret, and welcome everyone to my presentation. It was a great blessing for me to put this presentation together because it brought Lebanon back to me, and the years that I spent there studying and as a student. Making pilgrimage to the monasteries was a great blessing to me, and I hope that the blessing of the monasteries will be imparted to you in some respect through this presentation. I will give a short introduction, I will tell you a story, and then I will get right into the slides. So once upon a time in the 6th century, the Church of Antioch experienced a so-called golden age. At its height, it had more than 150 bishops. Churches, basilicas, hermitages, monasteries dotted the landscape. Syriac was the 3rd most important language of the empire, and great missionary endeavors were launched to Persia, Armenia, Georgia, India, and as far as China. And monasticism was the preferred way of life. Fast forward to the 19th century, and we see a very different situation for the Church of Antioch. The number of hierarchs decreases to less than 20. Conversions to Islam, Catholicism, and Protestantism decimate a once flourishing community. Priests are not properly educated. The faithful are not properly catechized. They don't understand the sacraments, and they don't know their saints. Monasticism, which had been so strong in these lands by the 1930s, had almost completely died out, and which had been such an organic part of church life. So in the early 1940s, a group of students in Beirut, Orthodox students, began discussing the idea of launching a movement that would revive the Church of Antioch. Very simply by teaching the sacraments and the saints of the Orthodox faith. And they wanted revival in every aspect of their society. They wanted a cultural revival, a linguistic revival, an artistic revival, an administrative revival. But they knew that to accomplish any of that, there had to be a spiritual revival. and that was why previous attempts to revive the church had failed, because spirituality was not the basis. They officially launched the Orthodox youth movement in 1942, and very patiently and carefully traveled to the towns and villages of Lebanon and Syria, teaching the Orthodox faith. In 2 short years, the movement spreads like wildfire, and they get more than 4,000 members. But while the church was revived and renewed through their efforts, something else happened, something almost accidental. And that was young people who were so on fire for their love for Christ and wanted to completely consecrate their lives to him, take the extra step and become monastics. And they go back to the ancient monasteries and reopen them. These monasteries had been completely abandoned. They reopen them, they start to live the monastic life. Just one problem: there's no one to teach them the monastic life. This is their story. So let's pretend for a minute that it's 1942. The Orthodox youth movement is making its way through the towns and villages of Lebanon and Syria. They come to a coastal city in Syria called Latakia, and they have the youth organize and attend the meeting in a church. One of the leaders of the movement, a law student, gets up and addresses the crowd, and he says, "Between us and God, there is a great obstacle. But if we can remove this obstacle, we will see God face to face." Another student gets up, another law student, he addresses the crowd, and this guy has the nerve to stand in the bishop's chair. And he quotes the Apostle Paul, and he says, "The churches of Asia greet you. Greet one another with a holy kiss." At the back of the room is a 14-year-old girl, and she's hiding because there's an age limit set on who can attend this meeting. But what these 2 students have to say just electrifies her soul and sets her life on a particular path. Who were these 3 people? The young man who talked about there being an obstacle was Habib Hazim, and he would eventually become Ignatius IV, Patriarch of Antioch. The guy who had the nerve to stand in the bishop's chair would become a bishop. And what a bishop, the Metropolitan George of Byblos and Mount Lebanon. He is considered the intellectual father of the Orthodox youth movement and the spiritual father of the revival of monasticism in Lebanon and Syria. It would not be too far off the mark to say that he has done for the Church of Antioch what Archbishop Anastasius has done for for Albania. The Metropolitan is also a profound scholar of Islam. When the imams are stuck on a particular passage in the Quran, they call the Metropolitan. The 14-year-old girl who was hiding in the back, she would become the great spiritual mother, Mother Antonina, abbess of the ancient monastery of Our Lady of Kaftoon. So let's start with her monastery. On the coastal road, as you head north from Beirut to Tripoli, you come to the region of Kura, which has historically been a stronghold of the Orthodox. And in the village of Kaftoon, you will find the monastery of Our Lady of Kaftoon. In 1977, Mother Antonina and Sister Lucy, just 2 sisters, reopened this ancient monastery, which for decades had been completely abandoned. It was so run down, they had to clear the animals out of the sanctuary. The monastery is set in a deep valley and is built right into a mountain of red limestone, so that when you enter the monastery, you enter the mountain. During Lebanon's 15-year civil war, the sisters said they felt safe because they were inside the rock. This is the soft limestone, and scholars believe that in ancient times, hermits would hollow out caves for themselves out of this rock. The oldest manuscript we have that mentions a monastery in Kaftoon is from the 13th century, but they are now discovering icons and frescoes that date much earlier. The monastery faces the ancient ruin of the 7th century church of St. Sergius and Bacchus. Crusaders, in their march on Jerusalem, came through this valley and stopped here. They ended up Latinizing the church by raising the vault and plastering over the Byzantine icons. The sisters have been working very hard to restore the church, and in 2002, a wonderful discovery was made of Byzantine icons behind the layers of plaster. Here is the front of the church, and just above, you can just make out the iconography that had been plastered over by the Crusaders. Here is one of the frescoes that a team of restorers from Poland have been working on. In these frescoes, you can see Arabic, Greek, and Aramaic writing, which attest to the cosmopolitan nature of the Church of Antioch in this period. This is an icon of Saint Sergius that is being restored. And here is a close-up on his face. And now we come to the monastery's Church of the Dormition. As I said earlier, when you enter the monastery, you enter the mountain. The iconostasis is completely carved out of rock. All the walls are completely exposed rock. The church's most important possession, and you can see it here on the right, is an icon from the 10th century, a unique double-sided icon. On the other side is the baptism of the Lord. And here is a close-up of the icon. The icon has been stolen from the monastery twice. The last person who took it returned it in the 1970s after having a dream of the Mother of God saying to him, "I don't bless the hands of sinners and murderers, return me to my home." Women who cannot have children pray to this icon, including Muslim women. This is the cemetery in back of the monastery with the graves of two of the sisters. The convent only recently built a cemetery for the nuns, and now Mother Antonina, who reposed in 2009, is one of the sisters buried there. The monastery today has 16 sisters who serve the church by their prayers, by painting original iconography, by translating patristic texts from Greek, French, and English into Arabic, which is a tremendous service to the church. And they are the spiritual mothers to the thousands of pilgrims that come through their doors every year, people from Beirut and throughout the country, from Syria and beyond. It's not been easy for the sisters to be monastics in Lebanese society. The country is dominated by Catholic Maronites, the largest and most powerful Christian sect. So many people in Lebanon, even Orthodox, would tell you our nuns should be like Catholic nuns, meaning social workers, working in hospitals and schools and orphanages. But Mother Antonina has remained steadfast, insisting that the first task of an Orthodox monastic is to pray. Any other kind of service to the church is secondary. The sisters call the monastery the Garden of the Mother of God. The monastery sits in an orange grove. This was taken in December during Lebanon's rainy season. And now on to the second monastery that I wanted to show you, a men's monastery, Our Lady of Hamatura. Hamatura is also located in the northern region of Kura. This is the gateway that welcomes you to the monastery as you begin climbing the walkway that will lead you to the monastery. The monastery has a very dramatic setting, perched on a slope in the ancient Kadisha Valley. Kadisha is a Syriac word meaning the sacred, and scholars believe that in the 6th century, there were as many as 40,000 monks and nuns living in this valley. The monks of Hamatura believe that monastics have occupied the mountain since the 6th century, when it was converted from a pagan temple. The oldest manuscript we have that refers to the monastery was written in Syriac in 1250. The only way to access the monastery is by hiking up a mountain. It takes about half an hour. Much of the path is made up of stone steps. Here's what the walkway looks like from the monastery. The first time I climbed this walkway was in the middle of the night with about 200 Lebanese and Syrians young people who had come for an all-night vigil at the monastery, and they lit their way with their cell phones and cigarette lighters up the mountain. This is the monastery's abbot, the priest monk Father Pendelaman. He has a very rich baritone voice and has been featured as principal chanter on television and in recordings. He was born and raised in the village that is at the foot of this mountain and remembers playing in the abandoned monastery as a child. He said his favorite game was hide and seek so that he could hide in the church and pray all day. He told me once, a monk is a person that has a very strong love for God and a simplicity like the one that Jesus had in the Bible. He should not only know God or only pray or only work, he should be able to make people feel his presence when he is among them. This should come naturally to him. This comes with prayer and with reading the lives of the fathers. It makes us live in simplicity. When he was a young monk at another monastery, he had many questions about the spiritual life. But because monasticism was still new, there were not any experienced spiritual guides. This was in the late 1970s. So like several other monks during the Lebanese Civil War, he went to Mount Athos in Greece, where he came under the guidance of another Lebanese monk there named Father Ishaq Attallah, who, by the way, would become the spiritual father to Mother Antonina and her nuns at Kaftoon. Some people say that Father Ishaq was the closest spiritual son to the great Athonite elder, Greek elder Paisius, who is now Saint Paisius. Going to Greece and Mount Athos would be very pivotal for the monks of Lebanon, because there they would actually see and experience the monastic tradition unbroken, and they would able to bring the ethos of the Athonite tradition back to Lebanon. Father Pandeleimon once said, in Greece, they used to tell us that we have books about your Antiochian monasticism, but books are not like practice. We wanted to see monasticism being practiced by people, not from books, because you can interpret books any way you like. When you experience something, it is different from when you read about it. It was Elder Paisius, pictured here, who encouraged the monks from Lebanon to return to their country, even at the height of the Lebanese Civil War, in order to reopen more monasteries. He said to the monks, if you stay on Mount Athos, you will be extras. If you return to Lebanon, it will mean more monasteries and more help for the church. Today, the monastery has 16 brothers, Lebanese and Syrians, and they farm their land as well as paint iconography, and like the Sisters of Kaftoon, translate patristic texts from Greek, French, English into Arabic and receive thousands of visitors. The brothers are challenged by the numbers of pilgrims they receive. People come not just to have a spiritual retreat, but because they have pressing problems. And when you live in a country like Lebanon, not only do you have your own personal problems, but you have to deal with the possibility of, I don't know, aerial bombardment by the state of Israel, which has happened more than once, or the country possibly slipping back into civil war, which is always a threat, or the Lebanese lira loses 80% of its value, which recently happened. So another challenge is that monasticism is relatively new here. It's not like Greece, that's had an unbroken tradition of monasticism. People there know how to behave with monastics. Here, they have to train people on what is proper behavior in the monastery. Here is the monastery church. Here is an icon that was discovered after a fire dating perhaps to the 10th century. And they have restored the Church of the Archangel Michael, and this is in the style of the churches on Mount Athos. Here is a view of the monastery and the valley. In 2008, the monastery had a very special discovery. There had been a monk of the monastery of the 14th century named Jacob, and he was martyred when he refused to convert to Islam. He is deeply venerated by the brothers. He's practically considered the patron of the monastery. They discovered his relics underneath the floorboards of the church. I wanted to show this as a special point to make about how the monks are influencing people. The couple you see in the foreground pictured here on that day had Father Pandeleimon bless their engagement. So they hiked up the mountain, got their blessing, attended liturgy, and hiked back down. Well, in Lebanese culture, which when it comes to celebration is over the top, they insist on paying thousands of dollars for dresses and parties and flowers and so on. But this young couple just in a very simple way wanted to have a blessing from Father Pandeleimon. And Father Pandeleimon said, this is the kind of simplicity that they're trying to impart to the people. Today, there are 11 thriving monasteries with over 100 monastics, compared to just 70 years ago, when these monasteries and a whole way of life had been completely abandoned. In closing, I hope you will allow me to encourage you in the strongest terms possible to visit the monasteries of Lebanon, the monasteries of Syria and Egypt and the Holy Land and other parts of the Middle East. Your brothers and sisters are waiting to give you a spiritual blessing. There is some instability in visiting places like these, but if you have a good guide who knows what they're doing, they will know exactly where to take you and how to keep you safe. And that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Amal. So if you stop sharing your screen for a moment. Lovely, thank you. Now I wanted to let you all know that there was, on YouTube, there is a wonderful short documentary which was originally shown on BBC about Hamatura, and I propose that I will show you, I'll share my screen and I'll show you just the short beginning of that to give you a bit more of an impression of how the brothers at Hamatura live together. I see some people have already seen it, but I'm sure you won't mind seeing a little bit again. It is on YouTube, so please forgive me if an advertisement comes up, but I won't be able to help that. But we will try doing it. Share screen.
صلوات الله القدسين صلوات الله القدسين صلوات الله القدسين
الصمت هو لغة الفردوس أو لغة الملكوت. ما بيقدر يكون اثنين عم بيحكوا ويقدروا يفهموا على بعضهم بنفس الوقت. الراهب بيسكت لسانه عن التحدث إلى الآخرين، ولكن داخله بيكون عم بيصلي باستمرار: يا رب يسوع المسيح ارحمني أنا الخاطئ.
So that was just a really short clip from that wonderful documentary. I do recommend you seek that out at another time. I'm going to put the link to it in our chat, but if you just go onto YouTube and search for The Good Struggle Hamatura, you should be able to find it. So that was such a kind of a wave of the monastic journey that Lebanon has been on for the last few years, and it was wonderful to hear how dynamic it has been, and from that wonderful movement in the 1940s, and people are already saying, you know, a wonderful presentation. It really was, and I know that you've studied a lot more, and in our conversation just before the presentation, you said you'd love to have talked a bit about Douma, and I wonder whether you can actually talk about that now. I know you don't have pictures, but I know that our listeners and viewers will love to hear about Douma and the connection with the UK.
Oh, okay, I'd be happy to. You know, the revival of monasticism in Lebanon came in different waves. And so we had the first wave, the first generation, who essentially did not know what they were doing and were leaning heavily on the leaders of the Orthodox youth movement to help them in the monastic life. Then you have the second wave who go to Mount Athos. Well, in Douma, the abbess of the monastery went to Essex during the Civil War. And she met Elder Sophrony, and he basically became her spiritual father. And so Douma Monastery, which is also in northern Lebanon, in this stronghold, this region that's the stronghold of the Orthodox, just like Essex, is a double monastery. They're inhabiting a structure also that is also very ancient, dating possibly to the 7th century. We don't have documentation of that, of course, but there's a particular door frame that has a design of a fish over it. And they're saying that this door frame was typical of something from the 7th century. So anyway, in Douma, you have nuns and monks occupying the monastery together, and they pray together, they eat together, and it's a very unique, it's a particular kind of life, and not every monastic is called to be in a monastery of men and women. Like some of them will say, that's too great a temptation for me. I need to be in a monastery that's only all men or only all women. So I noticed that when I was there, they had particular recommendations for interactions between the monks and the nuns. For example, if you're handing something to someone, you do not hand it to them. You set it down on a table or you put it on the floor. If you're speaking to someone, you do not make eye contact. You look at their forehead or you look at the ground. As the abbess explained it to me, she said, you know, why would you want to introduce yourself into someone else's soul? So they're very careful in their interactions together, that there's nothing that causes that introduction into the soul that she's talking about. So Elder Sophrony was their spiritual father. And I would say that the pattern of their lives is very much that similar to the other monasteries in Lebanon in terms of, you know, when they wake up and have prayers, how often they have liturgies a week, basically their monastic practice. I don't think they do like Essex, where I was told that in Essex, whole periods of time are spent where they're saying the Jesus prayer together out loud. I don't think they have that practice in Douma. So I think they feel very indebted to Elder Sophrony in that tradition.
That's wonderful. And yes, you're right. In St. John the Baptist Monastery, they pray the Jesus prayer together as a part of the typicon, if you like, that St. Sophrony put in place for them. So yeah, in some ways it's not surprising that they've chosen something slightly different at Douma. We've had a question from Christina who asks about Balamand, and Balamand is obviously in a different situation. It's an educational, a place of education, a university, as well as a monastery. But would you like to, I don't know, make comparisons, if you would like, with the places you've covered?
Oh, sure. So Balamand, there's a Balamand Monastery and there's a Balamand University. And the university is built very close to where the monastery is. And the university is an Orthodox liberal arts educational institution. The monastery, there used to be a monastery there, and now it's completely devoted to a theological seminary. And that theological seminary has been kind of a focal point of the revival of the church. So in terms of what I said earlier about, you know, back in the day, at the turn of the 20th century, the church was in this very depressed state, priests were not properly educated, people were not properly catechized. You know, Balamand had a very important revival there in terms of being a theological seminary and being a focal point. There are very few Orthodox seminaries in the Middle East. So Balamand attracts people from all over the Middle East. I met there actually a Georgian from the Republic of Georgia. Why he chose Balamand, it's amazing to me. He showed me his notebook. He had classical Arabic on one side, then Russian, then Greek, then Georgian, and he was basically keeping it all together so that he could study theology. Why he didn't go to Russia to study theology, I would probably for political reasons. So Balamand, the theological seminary, attracts people from throughout the Middle East and the region.
Yeah. And I wondered whether you could say a bit more about the work of Kaftoun and Hamatoura in meeting the needs of the local people. You've said something of that already, particularly with Hamatoura and the large numbers of pilgrims that are going there. Is that the same with Kaftoun? Are the local people kind of developing in their love for the monasteries?
Yeah, I mean, there's a parish in Kaftoon, and there's a priest there, of course, and the priest of the parish really loves the monastery. And so in the Church of Antioch, you know, the idea is that the monastery should be an organic part of the church. One of the elders said to me, the parish church without a monastery is like a widow. You know, so basically the monastery should be working cooperatively with the parish church. So yes, in Kaftoon, when the sisters first went back into the monastery in the 1970s to rebuild the monastery, you know, giving children catechetical lessons was an important part of their ministry to the village, and being part of kind of helping to revive Orthodox life there.
Yeah. We've had a question from Andrew, and he asks a question which you touched on in your presentation, but perhaps you could say a bit more. He says, is there a difference in quality between Lebanese monasticism when you compare it to Greek or Russian? And he also asked about Maronite. So you mentioned about the sort of social work aspect of many Maronite monastics. Is the quality of Orthodox monasticism in Lebanon distinct?
That's an excellent question. I'm so glad it was given, because I don't know it was clear in my presentation. But you know, when the Lebanese and Syrian monks went to Mount Athos, it was a tremendous gift to them. But they did not think that they were going to come back to Lebanon and immediately have the Mount Athos life. What they did was they adapted monastic life to the situation in Lebanon. And the situation is you have lots and lots of pilgrims coming into the monastery seeking help. So you cannot necessarily have the Athonite, you cannot completely duplicate the Athonite life. Another thing about Athonite monasticism and Russian monasticism and Serbian monasticism is that the Church of Antioch has no nationalism whatsoever. You will never see a nationalist flag in an Antiochian monastery. I went to a Greek monastery here in the United States. The first thing I saw before a cross was the church, the flag of Greece and the flag of the United States. So in Antioch, they say, this is our contribution to the body of Christ. We have no political frontiers. We are free politically. So that kind of that nationalism does not exist.
That's really fascinating. And I suspect a lot of people will have had the same experience with seeing that, those flags and the nationalism. Patrick has asked, are there links with the Holy Land, in particular the Church of the Resurrection, Jerusalem, and the monastic communities there? So Mar Saba, Marahia, all of those communities.
No, there's no contact. This is the tragedy of our age, the political situation. You know, a century ago, I could drive from Beirut to Jerusalem in 3 hours. You know, now Lebanon and Israel have no political links. They do not recognize each other. There's effectively a state of war. If you want to go to the Holy Land, you've got to go, I mean, you've got to either fly to Jordan, and then go from Jordan into Israel, and then hope they don't stamp your passport, because if they stamp your passport that you've been in Israel, you will not be let back into Lebanon. So unfortunately, the political situation has kept these vital links from happening between the monastics of the Holy Land. I'm just trying to think if there's anything else to say with that. It's just the tragedy of the political situation. And it's very sensitive also with the fact that, Israel has invaded Lebanon, twice. And so anyway, the two countries are in a state of war at this point and do not have, diplomatic ties.
Yeah, that's so sad. And I guess we should all pray for an improvement in that situation. Carol has asked, how is Metropolitan George? And I'd love to hear more about Metropolitan George, actually. He's not a figure that's well enough known, I think, in this country, even though we have many Antiochian communities.
Yes. Okay, so Metropolitan George Khudr is really just a profound scholar. He once told me he could not learn from any book that was less than 700 pages in length. A profound scholar of Islam, has been very active in ecumenical dialogue, but is really considered, the intellectual father of the revival of monasticism and the revival of the church. He was publishing, I don't think he's doing it anymore, but he had a daily column in one of the most popular newspapers, secular newspapers in the country. And he would write articles about, the political situation of the day, not in terms of a political angle, but just able to address things from a spiritual way without pushing orthodoxy on people or necessarily trying to convert people, just trying to give a spiritual angle to the many hardships of the Lebanese situation and the Syrian situation, of course.
And how is he?
Oh, he's retired now, and another metropolitan has taken over his jurisdiction, and has allowed him very graciously to remain in the house of the metropolitanate there. So he's not having to uproot himself. But he has published books. There's a book by him in English that's available from St. Vladimir Seminary Press. And I'm sorry, the name is escaping me now, but if you Google it, I think you can find it.
Yeah, perhaps someone could post it in the chat if they know it.
Okay.
We've had a question from, well, not so much a question, but a comment, but when you were saying about the sort of international openness of the Antiochians, I'm not sure whether that refers back to the Georgian student at Balamand, or perhaps the refusal to be nationalist in its approach. And Maria says that she feels that kind of trickles down to the Antiochian church around the world. Do you think that's a fair comment? And
what was the comment again?
So the openness of Antiochian church, the Church of Antioch, trickles down in the same way from the hierarchical monasteries.
Right. Well, of course, in the Arab world, nationalism only came on the scene in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. So the countries are not as old as European countries, and that's why there is not this sense of nationalism. Of course, in the Antiochian church, the church is made up of Syria and Lebanon. So that's another reason why and of course, Lebanon and Syria were once one country before Lebanon got its independence. So no, they feel that the gift of the Church of Antioch to the body of Christ is to not have this nationalism. And of course, when I was talking about the 6th century and the mosaics in Kaftoon, you could see Aramaic writing, Greek writing, and so on. And it really attested to the cosmopolitan nature of the church. So it has kept that flavor for some reason. And of course, I would only add that, the Arab Orthodox, have a different relationship with Islam than our Greek and Serbian brothers. They look at the Ottoman period as just blackness, just the worst days of their lives. And the Arab Orthodox say, no, the Ottoman period was feast and famine. You know, for us, you know, perhaps because we share a language with Islam, we were able to get along with Islam a little bit better and be more accommodated to it. So
that's interesting. And Patrick kind of builds on that question a little bit about getting on with your neighbours, about the Maronites. And
oh, yeah.
said that the Maronites are the, you know, the biggest Christian part of the Lebanese makeup. How is the relationship at all levels, really, with the monasteries, I suppose, in particular?
With the Maronite Church, you mean, or
yeah.
the Maronite community? There's, you know, in Lebanon, there's a lot of intermarriage. So Orthodox marry Maronites, and Maronites marry Shiites, and Sunnis marry Orthodox. I mean, it's a real mix there. So we do have Maronites visiting the monasteries. It's a cordial relationship. It's a little bit tricky because the Maronites, their hierarchs are trying to be political figures and really have a say in the political dynamics of Lebanon, whereas the Orthodox have never, ever been involved in the politics, the very tricky and complicated politics of Lebanon. As a matter of fact, at the start of the Lebanese Civil War, they came out with a communique and they said that for us, you know, we do not believe in war. War is never going to solve anything. Whereas the Maronites, who started the civil war, by the way, they picked the fight with Muslims. You know, they believe that the way to survive in the country is to have political activism. And they raised it to the point of militant activism during the Civil War, whereas the Orthodox did not.
A couple of people have posted the name of that book by Metropolitan George, The Ways of Child, The Ways of Childhood.
Ways of Childhood, exactly.
And someone's even posted the link to St. Vladimir's Seminary Press, so that's great, thank you. There's also a question, a sort of general question, could you recommend a good publisher of Orthodox books in Arabic?
Oh, in Arabic. I would say probably the University of Balamand. I don't know the name of their publishing division, but I would say that Balamand is probably the place that's going to be the publisher in Arabic, yeah.
Thank you. Someone's asked about the situation between the Church of Antioch and the Patriarchate of Jerusalem. Now, this is a very difficult issue, and I don't know whether you actually want to comment on it, but perhaps you could talk about it in sort of the relationship between the Orthodox in the region, more generally, perhaps, if you don't want to comment about the political situation.
Yeah, the Patriarchate of Jerusalem is very tricky because there, of course, when we talk about an Orthodox people, we're talking about a Palestinian Orthodox people, and they're ruled by an ethnically Greek patriarchate, bishops and patriarch. So it's a very difficult situation. They're experiencing now what the Lebanese and Syrians were experiencing in the 19th century when they were under a Greek patriarchate of priests not being educated. Young boys are not encouraged to be altar servers. So, you know, I don't think that, I mean, the way that the Orthodox Church in Lebanon and Syria would view that would be that the Palestinians need to have their own bishops and their own patriarch.
Thank you. I think this question comes out of what you were saying earlier about sort of intermarriage between different groupings in Lebanon, and how that this is turning into a wide-ranging question session, not just about monasticism, but thank you for bearing with us. Is intermarriage permitted without compelling the Christians to convert to Islam? Is the question from Mary.
You know, well, of course, Islam considers Judaism and Christianity to be the people of the book, so to speak. And so you know, conversion is not necessary. I mean, there have been Muslims who've married Christians and have not required the Christians to convert. So no, I don't think in Islam it's an absolute have to happen.
Yeah, thank you. I wondered if I could ask a little bit. You said that it was your greatest creative pleasure and creative activity to write about the revival of monasticism in the Church of Antioch. I wondered if you could tell us, if you don't mind, a little bit about why you chose that topic. What made you so interested?
When I studied in Lebanon, I initially was going to do my master's thesis on why the Orthodox were not involved in the Civil War. I thought maybe that there was a theological reason within the Orthodox faith that keeps people from being part of a civil war. And I interviewed Metropolitan George and I asked him that question. And he said, no, the only reason we didn't get involved in the Civil War was because our numbers are not big enough to have an army, which was kind of a surprising answer to me. And so I started visiting the monasteries for my own personal, you know, spiritual needs. And as I visited the monasteries and got to know the people there, I discovered that there was a story behind their revival. It's not as if these monasteries had just been there for, you know, functioning uninterrupted for centuries, that there was a real story behind how they reemerged and were resurrected. And I became fascinated with the story. And I decided that was so much more interesting than politics. And of course, in Lebanon, everything is politics, but so.
And I love the story about Mother Antonina just starting with one other sister,
Yes.
and starting at Kaftoon and building it from that tiny beginning. It reminded me very much, we had a presentation earlier in the series about Ormia, which was under the spiritual guidance of Elder Emilianos, but was you know, took over a piece of land with very little and has grown to something very large. Could you give us some idea of how the monasteries have grown since those founding days? I think in the documentary that I recommend people go and watch about Hamatura, Father Pantaleimon says that many people have gone and then left the monastery as well, so they have a sort of relatively small number now. But it would be interesting to know how the monasteries have grown, what sort of sizes they are now.
Yeah, that's a good question. When you go to Eastern Europe, it's not like going to Romania or Greece and you go to a monastery and there's 100 monastics, you know, or Russia, where that might be the case. So in a country like Lebanon, you know, the Christian population has become significantly smaller, even though in Lebanon, relative to the population, you have the highest number of Christians relative to the population. The largest number of Christians is in Egypt. So anyway, so when you go to a typical monastery in Lebanon, you know, a big monastery, like Hamatura is considered a big monastery that has 18 monastics in Hamatura. You know, Kaftoon probably at this point has about 15 nuns. So that's a healthy size, but sometimes you find that there's just one person going to an ancient monastery and trying to rebuild it. There was a monastery in southern Lebanon, an ancient monastery. There was one monastic. He had spent years and years and years rebuilding it, and then it was destroyed with an Israeli airstrike during one particular invasion. So in the case of Kaftoon, you only needed 2 sisters working together to reopen the monastery, and then more sisters came after that.
Claire has asked about the young people's movement that you've spoken about that started in the 1940s and how powerful it was, and the spiritually hungry people. How long did it take them to move forward with that movement? How to engage young people again and get them interested?
Well, of course, we're talking about the 1940s, so they didn't have the benefit of, you know, the internet or information or any way to disseminate their movement. but it's really just amazing. You know, they started in 1942, and, you know, they were very patiently going to the towns and villages of Lebanon and Syria. And within 2 years, they had 4,000 members. And the movement was so powerful, it spread to Egypt. Egypt got a hold of their literature, and it started in Egypt something called the Sunday School movement. So the Egyptians adapted it to the Coptic church and to their reality. And so it was just a very powerful movement of the Holy Spirit to revive the church.
That's really interesting. I didn't know there was such a link with the Coptic tradition there as well. I haven't got any more questions. I encourage people to put another question if they have it. I wondered whether you could say a bit more about how they deal with pilgrims. I mean, you said that when you went to Hamatura and there were 200 of you going up the mountain, you know, lighting the way with cigarette lighters. This just sounds incredible. But can they handle that many pilgrims? It seems amazing.
Right. You know, of course, it was an all-night prayer vigil, and so literally the young people were there attending church outdoors. It was not in the church because it wouldn't have been able to accommodate all those people, and so they basically stayed up all night. So you know, having people come and visiting the monasteries, you know, the monastics feel particularly called, you know, in Lebanon to minister to the parish church. And so they're a little bit more open to kind of mixing with pilgrims than, say, Greek monasteries or Romanian monasteries. You know, for example, if you go and visit, I mean, I used to go and visit, and Mother Antonina would receive me in the living room and have coffee served, and we would sit and talk with an hour. And I don't know that necessarily would happen if you go to Eastern Europe or if you go to Greece, where they're more set on a separation, a kind of healthy separation between the monastics and between people. But, you know, in Lebanon, they're a little bit more open because they feel particularly called to help the parish church. And Father Pandeleman said to me once, we're the muscles of the church. They really believe that monasticism is, you know, the kind of the engine of the church, and that it's very important that the parish church have an organic relationship with a monastery. Yeah. And that's our challenge in the West, isn't it? For us, you know, we're all in these Orthodox deserts, and if there's a monastery near us, you know, thanks be to God, you know, but that's not the situation for everyone living in the West. And you know, in Father Pandeleman said to me once, you know, because of the pressures on the Lebanese with their lives and the political situation, the economic situation, everything that's going on, the desire, the temptation to immigrate to the West is very great. And he says to them, I understand that you want to go to the West where there's privilege and there's wealth and there's jobs and there's peace. But, you know, remember, here you have the monasteries and you have Christ here. So,
yeah. I wonder whether you're aware of the situation in recent weeks after the terrible explosion in Beirut, and how the monasteries are coping and perhaps helping, being those muscles that they need to be. Are you aware of what's happening at the moment?
I've been keeping track of kind of what's going on with Lebanon, not so much with the monasteries, but I imagine this is the situation that's going on, is that, you know, the explosion in the port, you know, 300,000 people were made homeless. And there have been situations where the monasteries have taken people in, basically. You know, during the Syrian war, which is still going on, you know, Hamatura has housed Syrian refugees, and Kaftoon was housing Syrian refugees. So I imagine, you know, if there are people that have been made homeless because of the explosion, you know, I would not be surprised if the monasteries have allowed some of them to stay there.
Yeah. I think, you know, all of us feel for the situation in Lebanon. So it was so awful that I'm sure you're right that it's been a big movement of people, and hopefully the monasteries are able to help those people. And I will remind everyone that we are going to make donations to all the monasteries that we featured, including both Kaftoun and Hamatura, and I've just put the link to the donation link again in the chat. I've had so many messages of thanks for your wonderful presentation, and you've been such an engaging speaker. Thank you. I haven't got any more questions from our viewers. I just wondered if there was anything you'd like to say, a final anecdote or a final message to us about perhaps going to Lebanon and visiting these monasteries?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say two things. You know, when the two nuns, Mother Antonina and Sister Lucy, went and reopened the monastery, you know, they were facing a lot of difficulties, you know, but Sister Lucy said that because they felt particularly called to do this, they had the joy of 100 nuns, you know, even though there were just two of them. And then just the final thing, you know, we're all united in one church, you know, and but there is something special about the mother church, about, you know, these original patriarchates. You know, they've been the guardians of the faith, and they've endured tremendous hardship through centuries. And they are very excited about orthodoxy spreading in the West. They think it's wonderful. And they want to impart a spiritual blessing to believers in the West. And really the best way to do that is to go visit them. And I hope that, you know, I'm a keen viewer of the BBC myself. I love watching the BBC. But, you know, it's so easy, you know, when you hear of what's happening in the Middle East through all the turmoil, it's easy to think that bombs are exploding on every street corner, but that's not the case. That is not the case. And I just want to encourage people to make a pilgrimage to these monasteries. And there are good and reputable guides who can take you there and keep you safe and know exactly where to go and understand the realities of the situation on the ground. So my encouragement is to go.
And Saide has just made a comment which is perfectly appropriate, which says, just cross yourself and go visit these monasteries in Lebanon. The saints of that land will intercede for your safety. So I think we will finish our session this evening there. We will ask the prayers of Saint Jacob of Hamatura, of the Mother of God, and I do encourage people to go and visit if they can. Thank you so much, Amal. Really grateful for your presentation, and I'm sure all of us have got a lot from this, and I hope that we get to meet sometime in the future, not on a computer screen. That would be really wonderful.
Yes, it would.
Thank you everyone for joining us. That's the end of the session, and so I will end the meeting there.